You know, I've spent the last 3 years researching United Nations Agenda 21, and it's shocking to me that every time I think I've learned all there is, I learned that much more. So tonight I'm going to present to you the Global to Local Action Plan for Sustainable Development, called Agenda 21, and how sustainable development is transforming your community and with your property rights under fire. Before we get started, I'd like you to meet a few people. Meet Betty Perry of Orem, Utah. She was arrested for not watering her lawn. You'll notice she's got a little wound on her nose. That's where armed code enforcement officers brought her down on her front porch and placed her under arrest. Meet Jacques and Marcel Dupuy from Llano, California. They live in the desert outside of Los Angeles, California. They built this wonderful little cottage, and they plan to retire there. You can see they're up in age, and they had retired. And being out in the desert, of course, you don't find, it's kind of difficult to imagine drilling a well. You have to dig to China for that one. Or, and you don't, of course, get public water. So they were approved for a water storage tank. And water would be trucked in, and they did all the necessary things they needed to do to preserve the water. But they were approved for this, as well as getting all the necessary building permits to build their property with this water tank. And, but in spite of that, there was a change in code enforcement, or a change in the code that required a water treatment system that would have cost them $80,000, which was more than their land or their cottage cost them to build. So they were forced to dismantle their entire cottage, every nail, every board, and they were forced off the land. They could no longer live there. Even though they still owned the property, they were still liable for taxes on the property, but they could no longer occupy the property. 1,500 people in Dade County, Florida, are losing their homes because the EPA says that they're living on a wetlands, even though the Army Corps of Engineers has done a study of their soil and said there is no wetlands. Can you imagine thinking you own your home, it's your property, it's paid for, or you may have a mortgage, but then suddenly you've got to move off of your property because you're on a wetlands. It's the most insane thing I've ever heard. You're still responsible for the mortgage, you're responsible for the taxes, but you're now homeless. Landowners with 5 acres of land or more in King County, Washington, have lost the use of 65% of their land due to something called the 65-10 rule, where 65% of your property must remain natural and undisturbed. And we're seeing that happening all over the United States. Now we'll bring it a little closer to home. This is Greg Garrett. He's a real estate broker, and when the real estate market went soft, he thought he would supplement his income by starting an oyster farm. He had his property, you can see it there, laid out right there where the York River meets the Chesapeake Bay. Prime location for growing and harvesting oysters. In fact, he even rented that part of the waterfront from the state of Virginia, and he received the necessary permits and licenses to grow, harvest, sell, and even export his oysters. His land is zoned for agriculture, and the federal and state government recognize aquaculture as agriculture, but York County decided they were going to change the definition, which excluded aquaculture from agriculture, and now they're trying to force him to shut the family-owned business down. So he's having to fight this in court. Meet Martha Bonetta. Many of you have probably heard of her. The stories have been traveling all over the internet lately. She has a farm in Fauquier County, and she was recently threatened with a fine of $5,000 for failure to obtain a permit to hold a birthday party for a 10-year-old family friend. They had about a dozen kids there. And it's because she has a commercial farm and she sells her produce right there on the farm with a produce stand. And they said that when you have a commercial business, you cannot have a social gathering without a special permit. Even though this was a family friend, it had nothing to do with the business whatsoever. They went on to harass this lady so much, they ended up not even renewing her permit to sell her produce on her farm because she went out and got so much publicity over it. But this is the kind of thing we see happening all over the United States. But why? It's something we need to look more closely at, because in the United States property rights matter. It was so important that the founders made certain that there were protections for property rights in the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. But you know, that's not the way that everyone thinks around the world. In fact, there are many countries who don't believe that you should have private property rights or you should be allowed to own property. If you live in Panama, for example, you can purchase land, but it doesn't mean you'll keep it. Government can take it at any time, for any reason, without any compensation. So now we're going to look at what is behind some of the property rights violations that we've been talking about. We'll begin with the 1976 UN Conference on Human Settlements that took place in Vancouver. Section 1 of the document that they provided in the Vancouver Declaration provides for the preamble, and it states, "Land, because of its unique nature and the crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. Social justice, urban renewal and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole." So no longer would your land serve your personal individual interest, but it's to be used for the interest of society as a whole. And this is the way they think in the United Nations, made up mostly of socialist countries. The document goes on to say that excessive profits resulting from the increase in land value are one of the principal causes of the concentration of wealth in private hands. Therefore, governments should recapture excessive profits due to increased land values to redistribute to the public at large. Public ownership of land should be exercised in favor of the common good rather than to protect the interest of the already privileged. Attention should be paid to the separation of land ownership rights from development rights, the latter to be entrusted to a public authority. This document set the stage for 65 pages of very specific land use recommendations. And the UN General Assembly was asked to take this declaration and put together a strategy for reducing poverty. Now I want to introduce you to one of the major players, Meet Gro Harlem Brundtland. She's the former Prime Minister of Norway. In fact, she served as Prime Minister 3 times. She's a very popular lady. She was also the Vice President of the World Socialist Party and the Chairman of the Brundtland Commission, named after her, of course. Now, the Brundtland Commission was the commission charged with developing this strategy for reducing poverty around the world. You might find it interesting to to know that there is the World Socialist Party right here in the United States. And to give you some idea of how these people think, I went to their website, and what they say are about their mission and their principles is the WSP of the United States is part of a global socialist movement that believes capitalism cannot meet the needs of the majority of the people in the world, however progressive it might become. To meet these needs, capitalism must be replaced by socialism. So this is the kind of thinking that was behind the development of sustainable development. At the 1987 UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission issued their report called Our Common Future. I happen to have a copy of it right here. It's available for purchase online. It's not something I made up, it's real. And in this report, it says that it describes sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, that sounds pretty good. That sounds like something we could all support, right? But this is just some of the very flowery words they use to garner support from the masses. But if you read a little further, they also say, poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. So now for the first time, they're linking poverty and the environment. Throughout the Cold War, the environmentalists and socialists were at odds with one another. They were very unlikely allies. But now they're working together, and they've developed a strategy using environment as the excuse. And they go on to say that in order to achieve equity, there must be a balance of economy and the environment, and we'll discuss that a little more closely in a moment. Also in this book, they provided the data from the World Bank for the per capita GDP by groups of countries, from the very poorest of nations to the very wealthiest. And they described their strategy for transferring the wealth of the very wealthy nations to that of the very poor nations. And they state so specifically in this document. They took these ideas for these strategies, and they were to come up with a strategy for worldwide sustainable development using the principles from the Vancouver Declaration for Land Use, coupled with a strategy for reducing poverty, to come up with the plan for sustainable development. At the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, otherwise known as the Earth Summit, more than 18,000 people attended, including then President George H.W. Bush, many of the federal agency heads, as well as leaders of environmental groups around the world. Maurice Strong was the chairman of the conference. He was also the former director of the UN Environment Program, the chairman of the World Wildlife Foundation, and a member of the Brundtland Commission, which provided this document. He was quite a character. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had become a multimillionaire. He was an oil tycoon in the Middle East and in Canada. And he also purchased 200,000 acres in Colorado with the richest water aquifer in the United States, and made millions upon millions piping water all over the southwest part of the country. Until the environmentalists came in and booted him out, which was kind of surprising since 3 years prior to that he had been the director of the UN Environment Program. But in his keynote speech at the Commission, he said that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. In a subsequent interview, he went on to say Is it the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? So this is the kind of thinking behind sustainable development. And they went on to reveal the plan for sustainable development called Agenda 21. And in the very first paragraph of the document, it says, Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which human impacts on the environment. You can read it for yourself online. All you have to do is Google United Nations Agenda 21, and you can also purchase it online. In its preamble, it says that we are confronted with a perpetuation of disparities between and within nations, a worsening of poverty, hunger, ill health, and illiteracy. However, integration of environment and development concerns and greater attention to them will lead to the fulfillment of basic needs. No nation can achieve this on its own, but together we can, in a global partnership for sustainable development. The developmental and environmental objectives of Agenda 21 will require a substantial flow of new and additional financial resources to developing countries. So there it tells you again what Agenda 21 is all about. It's about a redistribution of wealth. In its 40 chapters, Agenda 21 addresses virtually every aspect of human life. Some of the more important chapters address plans for the control of land use, housing, transportation, food production, consumption patterns, water, energy, the role of business and industry, and healthcare. Well, there's not too many things left in life once they take control of all those things. 179 nations agreed to adopt Agenda 21, and President George H.W. Bush was the signatory for the United States. Now, Agenda 21 was a soft law, not a treaty. So it was not binding. There was nothing stating that any nation around the world, even though they had signed on to this soft law, there was nothing binding them to implementing it. So they had to come up with a way of making it a reality. So they devised the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was a treaty. And in the document it says that it was conceived as a practical tool for translating the principles of Agenda 21 into reality. The document was called the Global Biodiversity Assessment. Now, I haven't read all of this document. It's 1,142 pages. I don't think it's any longer available online for purchase, but it is available to read online. You just Google it and you can find it. But in its 1,142 pages, I did read what they say is not sustainable. Any skiers here? Because ski slopes are not sustainable. On page 783, it says backyard ponds are not sustainable. Pastures for grazing livestock is not sustainable. Golf courses, any golfers here? It's not sustainable. Highways and transportation by car is not sustainable. Dams are not sustainable. Our system of justice is not sustainable. They want to transfer our system of equal justice and protection of individual liberty to one of social justice to protect the rights of the collective. Consumerism is not sustainable. They say we consume too much. The family is not sustainable. They say we must reduce the population to 1 billion. Well, we're currently setting it a little over 7 billion. How do you suppose they plan to do that?
Vaccines.
Single-family homes are not sustainable. So that will tell you the direction the sustainable development is going. And on page 993, they begin to reveal the Wildlands Project. This is the map that was presented on the U.S. Senate floor in July of 1994 by Dr. Michael Kaufman. And it prompted the U.S. Senate to table that treaty on biodiversity that I told you about. And it was never put to a vote. It was never ratified. The areas you see in red represent 50% of the American landscape. It would be off limits to human existence. You could, I guess, hike on it, but you couldn't drive on it. There would be roadless areas. You couldn't live there. You couldn't camp there. Nothing more than hiking, nothing that would really be too invasive on the environment. The areas you see in yellow would be highly regulated, very limited use areas. The areas you see in light green or turquoise, those would be zones for normal use. That's where we would be allowed to live in high density urban development. Sustainable development is illustrated to depict the proper balance between equity, economy, and the environment. They say in order to achieve equity, the individual must give up their personal wants for the needs of the collective. Economic policy calls for the international transfer of wealth, and free markets are replaced with public-private partnerships. Their environmental policies make individual rights subordinate to environmental needs. So let's look at these a little more closely. To achieve equity, they'll use law to restructure nature, again to coerce us into giving up our wants to provide for the needs of the collective. Meet Harvey Rubin. Believe it or not, he's an American. He's a member of the ICLEI Executive Committee. He is the clerk of courts in Miami-Dade County. Remember the 1,500 people who were driven off their homes by the EPA? You think they're going to get any help in Dade County? He's the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Task Force, and he was the keynote speaker at the Rio Plus 10 Summit, which was the 10th anniversary of Agenda 21. He said in his keynote speech, "The American system of justice must be changed to conform to that of the rest of the world, and there must be a shift in attitudes. Individual wants, needs, and desires are to be conformed to the views and dictates of government planners. In the process of implementing sustainable development, individual rights will have to take a backseat to the collective." Now, who in America talks like that?
Only traitors.
Well, the man is a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah. That figures.
Their economic policy calls for the transfer of wealth, and it says so in Article 8 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. It states that equity will be achieved through the transfer of resources to developing countries. And they call for public-private partnerships. Now, we've been accustomed to having public-private partnerships. They're unique arrangements that we have with a private company and government for the purpose of, well, it's been used for building roads, for example. The problem is, they want all business to be part of a public-private partnership. The problem with that is that the PPP will get all the tax breaks. They'll have limited liability because government's going to share that with them. They'll have easy access to federal funding. They'll create monopolies. They'll receive subsidies, as they already do. And they'll have very large contracts, making an awful lot of money off of you and I. So then what happens to free enterprise? Well, it begins to topple. They have the higher taxes. They have to assume all of the liability. They have very limited access to federal funding. They have to compete with the monopolies. They have the high cost of doing business. They don't receive subsidies, and they struggle to survive. So goodbye free enterprise. Environmental policy puts nature above man, where individual rights are subordinate to the environment, and they make it very clear in Principle 1. They say, human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Well, excuse me, if someone entitles you to something, they can take it away. I entitle myself to a healthy and productive life. And the very thought, the very suggestion that I'm only entitled to it if I'm in harmony with nature, I find very offensive. In Principle 8, they say, to achieve sustainable development, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but remember all those things they said were not sustainable? June 14, 1993, the White House issued a press release announcing the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And the very first goal that they listed in this press release says, it's to respond to the recommendations in Agenda 21, the Comprehensive International Policy Declaration nations of the world agreed to as a pledge to global environmental action and contribute to the U.S. plan to be submitted to the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, the international commission created at the Earth Summit, to help ensure implementation of Agenda 21. So they've announced their plan, they've announced the goal. They're going to do it by executive order. Remember, we didn't get that treaty. "15 days later, President Bill Clinton issued Executive Order 12852, creating the President's Council on Sustainable Development. They were responsible for translating the policy recommendations in Agenda 21 into policy for America to be administered by agencies of the federal government using rule-making authority." So they're bypassing legislation, folks, using regulation. And this is a copy of the document. It was available online. You can also read it online. The United Nations was delighted, and they announced it on their own website. They said that created by a 1993 executive order, the President's Council on Sustainable Development is explicitly charged with recommending a national action plan for sustainable development to the President. The PCSD submitted its report, Sustainable America, A New Consensus, to the President in early 1996. In the absence of a multi-sectoral consensus on how to achieve sustainable development in the United States, the PCSD was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. So now you've had the White House issue a press release stating to you that they will use executive order to implement Agenda 20. The goal is to implement Agenda 21. And you see now that it's announced. That's the website I've put right there at the bottom of the page. You can go right there and read it for yourself. The United Nations has announced it as well. So why isn't local government hearing about it? Why aren't the masses hearing about it? Why haven't we heard about it in the news? Why aren't we hearing about it everywhere? Well, there's a very good explanation for that. Meet J. Gary Lawrence. He was the advisor to the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and he helped draft the Millennium Papers. And in those Millennium Papers, of course, they were strategizing how they would go about implementing Agenda 21 using the rulemaking authority. He stated, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we will call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. So they'll do it by changing the name, and no one will ever know it's connected to Agenda 21. Isn't that nice? And by the way, you can Google any of these documents. Just look up J. Gary Lawrence, the Millennium Papers. This might be a good time to take a break. And where we left off is why local governments, the media, and most of us have never heard of Agenda 21. So how is it being implemented? Well, largely through federal grants. Now, there were 12 federal agencies who were members of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and 6 of those 12 are providing local governments with grants, and they all come with strings attached. Okay, and this is available now directly to local governments. So this is how they're using rulemaking authority. To give you an example, Chesterfield County, for example, accepted $2.7 million from the Department of Energy under the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. Well, the eligibility requirements require that certain provisions of cap and trade be implemented in order to receive those funds. The EPA registered its commitment to provide the challenge grant to local governments in the Federal Register, Volume 63, number 163, in August of 1998, on page 45,157. They say that Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program is also a step in implementing Agenda 21, the global plan of action on sustainable development signed by the United States at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. They say, oh, but that was so long ago. They've abandoned that. Well, not so fast. In January the 3rd of 2012, they furthered their commitment through something they call the Path Forward. And they say that the EPA's Path Forward has begun to address this need for systematic incorporation by realigning EPA's entire research enterprise around the concept of sustainability. This has required agency scientists and managers to recognize the widely used definition of sustainability outlined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987, meeting the needs of the current generation while preserving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To fully embrace this definition, here we go, folks, the commonly recognized pillars of sustainability, economy, environment, and of course they call it society. Society, social equity, social justice, equity, it's all the same, have been systematically integrated into EPA's research portfolio. So they're reiterating their commitment to Agenda 21 in this document. There are other NGOs who are working to implement Agenda 21. This is just a very small handful of the many hundreds of environmental groups and wildlife groups who are in favor of implementing Agenda 21 because it also consequently implements what they want, and that's to rewild most of America's landscape. Here's another NGO that many of you may recognize, ICLEI. ICLEI stands for the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives, but they call themselves Local Governments for Sustainability. And when you ask them, they claim, in fact they're coming out reporting everywhere, that they have no connection to the United Nations, they have nothing to do with implementing Agenda 21, that this is just all a bunch of fabrication. Well, this is their document. It's called the Local Agenda 21 Planning Guide. It's signed by them, ICLEI. It's got their logo on the bottom. And in the foreword, it says, ICLEI has the task of mobilizing and technically supporting Local Agenda 21 worldwide. Those are their words, folks, not mine. It says so in their own document. And you can Google that and find it. You can read the entire document online. Now, it's not just a matter of paying dues to become a member of ICLEI either, because they have an agenda. Their membership requirement is a resolution pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, how do you do this? You do this through strict land use regulation. But they require you to set 5 milestones. Milestone 1 is to inventory the emissions. 2, set a target, goal. 3, establish a local action plan. 4, implement the local action plan. And 5, monitor, evaluate the progress. Now remember that convention on biological diversity, you know, the treaty that was never ratified? Well, things aren't moving quite as fast as the United Nations would like in the United States. So in June of 2011, President Obama issued Executive Order 13575, creating the White House Rural Council, giving the federal agencies control over food, fiber, and energy. So now they can regulate everything related to the production of food, fiber, and energy without any legislation or any act by Congress or state governments. That's a pretty frightening thought. And its counterpart was issued by executive order in March 15th of 2012, the counterpart being smart growth. President Obama issued Executive Order 13602, creating the White House Council on Strong Cities and Strong Communities. So now you have, by executive order, we're essentially creating the biodiversity plan. To further the agenda, they're doing so through education. In 2003, the International Conference on Education for a Sustainable Future declared 2005 through 2014 as the decade of education for sustainable development, and they named UNESCO as the leader of that effort. Consequently, in 2002, President George W. Bush rejoined the United States to UNESCO. At the conference, UNESCO said that the decade of ESD is a far-reaching and complex undertaking that potentially touches on every aspect of life. The basic vision is a world where everyone learns the values, behavior, and lifestyles required for a sustainable future and for positive societal transformation. So they are admitting that it touches on every aspect of life. So if there's any question about that in any of their mind, they all know it. One of the requirements by UNESCO, or by the federal government under UNESCO, is that every college and university must provide a program for sustainable development in order to receive federal funding. This is more of that funding with strings. You can even get a degree in sustainable development. But it didn't stop there. Through No Child Left Behind, it made its way through K through 12 public schools. In Virginia, we call it greening Virginia's K through 12 public schools. And there are ongoing case studies and surveys to check on the progress of implementing sustainable development practices and social justice principles into the curriculum. throughout Virginia. You can also find this online. You can Google it through the Virginia Sustainable Building Network. And it's available there. In fact, you can even see one of their more recent reports, but they do periodic surveys. I'd like to show you this as well. A grandmother in Powhatan County, Virginia gave me this about 4 months ago, 4 or 5 months ago. Her granddaughter came home with it from school. It's called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, a children's edition of Agenda 21. It came with a little workbook or activity.
What grade?
It was elementary school. I don't know if she even told me what grade. This was in our public school. So how is it making its way to the local level? We've seen how it comes through with grants, but how are they writing those plans with those specific details? Well, the American Planning Association was given a $5 million grant to draft the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. Now, it's a 2-volume guidebook. I happen to have both of them. Here's the cover of one. I didn't bring them with me because it's a total of about 1,500 pages, weighs about 12 pounds, so it's pretty heavy to carry around. Haven't read all of it yet, but I've read enough to be very disturbed by some of the things that I see. This is also available online, by the way. You don't have to purchase the book. I think the book is something like $120 for the 2 volumes, but you can read it online for free. They're part of a global planners network, the American Planning Association. And in their own statement of principles on the planners network, it says that we believe that planning should be a tool for allocating resources and developing the environment to eliminate the great inequalities of wealth and power in our society. Very telling, isn't it? Goes on to say that we believe that planning should be used to assure adequate food, clothing, housing, medical care, jobs, safe working conditions, and a healthful environment. We advocate public responsibility for meeting these needs because the private market has proven incapable of doing so. Well, excuse me, but the last time I checked, the private market was very capable of providing us, of selling us adequate food, clothing, housing, medical care, providing jobs, until government got involved. They've also adopted something called the precautionary principle, and the precautionary principle is something that we see a lot of local governments adopting in their local comprehensive plans. Every agency of the federal government has adopted the precautionary principle. And they all word it a little different, but it all says basically the same thing. The American Planning Association says it this way: where threats of serious or irreversible damage to people or nature exist, anticipatory action will be taken to prevent damage to human and environmental health, even when full scientific certainty about cause and effect is not available, with the intent of saving the quality of life for current and future generations. Well, I'm sorry, if you're going to take my private property, by golly, I want to see the science. I want scientific certainty. Because I can't so much as cut down a tree in my yard without a permit. And I bet none of you can either. It goes, this also comes out of Agenda 21, Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration. They word it a little bit different, but it's the same thing. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Now, folks, this is their words, not mine. And this is coming from the American Planning Association, trickled down from the United Nations Agenda 21. And there's a lot of other things that I can pick on with the American Planning Association, but there's one that absolutely knocked my socks off. To put it in Glenn Beck's words, it made my eyes bleed. It was something called the amortization of non-conforming uses. This is what was used on the little couple out in the desert in Mono, California, because their property no longer conformed to current standards. Well, what's to worry about, right? We have a Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, that says that they can't take your property without just compensation. But for homeowners who live in a community that adopts the guidebook's vision, the APA amortization proposal means the extinguishing over time of their right to occupy their houses and without just compensation for loss of that property. How long they have before they must forfeit their homes would be completely up to the local government. Now, this is after going through a very long Chapter 8 from the American Planning Association's manual, their blueprint for Agenda 21. This was the summary that was developed by the Heritage Foundation. Many of you may have heard of Wendell Cox. He's one of the senior research fellows for the Heritage Foundation. This is his brief summary after reading that chapter. But I'll give you the specific words that tell you they can take your land. This is out of Chapter 8, their words, not mine, in the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. A local government zoning ordinance may state a period of time after which non-conforming land uses, structures and/or signs, or designated classes of non-conforming land uses, structures and/or signs must terminate. Local government decides how long that will be. Hopefully, it'll be long enough for you to at least get your mortgage paid off, but you never know. With some, it's been a lot less. But I find that absolutely shocking. As a matter of fact, if you read that document carefully, they also say that it could pose some constitutional challenges. They admit to that in that chapter. They recently put out a survey. They were trying to get support for planning, and they came out saying that they had it. Their finding was that the community planning is seen as needed by a wide majority of demographics, of all demographics. 79% agree, 9% disagree, 12% don't know. Wow, well, if 79 people agree that community planning is needed, then who am I to argue, right? But if you look what was actually on the survey, it's very telling because they give you lots of flowery words to get the answer that they want. This is what they said in the actual document. Community planning is a process that seeks to engage all members of a community to create more prosperous, convenient, equitable, healthy, and attractive places for present and future generations. Well, who wouldn't agree with that, right? So they frame everything in such a way with lots of flowery language that you couldn't possibly disagree. And that's how they come up with their so-called consensus.
That's right.
The actual question they asked after they made the statement is generally, do you agree or disagree that your community could benefit from a community plan? And they went on to survey how many people knew about or agreed with Agenda 21. They said only 6% of those surveyed expressed opposition to Agenda 21, while 9% expressed support for Agenda 21. And 85%, the vast majority of respondents, don't even know about Agenda 21. This came out of Planning America Perceptions and Priorities, June the 14th, 2012. So what they do is they paint a picture with lots of flowery words and ask you to choose between this property or this one. So what are you going to pick? So that's how they get the answer that they want. And they come to the so-called consensus. Well, it's the consensus of the community that you want this. But now you see how they go about arriving at that consensus. They paint the picture with words to make you choose between one of these. In 1994, the Virginia General Assembly established a task force to study Sustainable Development Agenda 21. And in 1997, House Document Number 6 was distributed to the governor, then George Allen, and the General Assembly that outlined the concept of Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, origins and policies, and it called Agenda 21 by name, the current Sustainable Development initiatives, Sustainable Development projects in Virginia, and a strategic plan for Virginia, which was primarily through regional planning district commissions, okay, where you have unelected governing boards making decisions for the community. This document is available online. You can Google it. I have a copy of it right here. That Convention on Biological Diversity, you know, the treaty that was never ratified. Well, we have lots of legislation that's been passed right here in our own state, which helped to implement this, even though there's no treaty. Among them are urban development areas, which I'm happy to say are now optional rather than mandatory. Open Space Easement Act, the Conservation Easement Act, the Purchase and Transfer of Development Rights, Wetlands, and Wetlands Mitigation Banking. Now, there are many others that contribute to it as well, but these are some of the most important that lay the framework for the biological biodiversity of land. You might also be interested in knowing that there's a Virginia Wildlife Action Plan that was published by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies that says programs that provide technical and financial assistance for habitat conservation and restoration on private lands are vital to sustaining Virginia's rich and diverse wildlife resources. How about that? So there are programs to provide technical and financial assistance for habitat conservation and restoration on your private property. They're seen to be vital to sustaining Virginia's rich and diverse wildlife resources. Well, you know what I see coming in Virginia? If we're going to stop this, remember that 65-10 rule, where you lose use of 65% of your land? It has to be left natural and undisturbed. That's what they're talking about here. And we're already seeing some localities in rural areas in Virginia trying to pass an ordinance for the 65-10 rule. They've tried to do it in Culpeper. So that's something to watch for. Meet Michael Chandler. He's the past president of the Virginia chapter of the APA, the American Planning Association. Surprise. He's the past president of the Virginia Citizens Planning Association. He's the past president of the Virginia Community Development Society. He's the member of the American Planning Association National Board of Directors, representing Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and on and on. And he is the Director of Education for Plan Virginia, which is the trade name for the Citizens Planning Education Association of Virginia. Okay, so what? He's real involved in planning and he's involved with the APA, so what? Well, the majority of Plan Virginia members are planning commissioners in the state of Virginia, approximately 85% of them. And the Virginia Certified Planning Commissioners Program is designed to provide the legal and technical background needed by citizen planners and decision makers, and a growing number of localities are already requiring their administrative and support staff to complete the course. And I can tell you, now it has reached higher than 85% of localities across the state of Virginia are required to complete this course. So you have the man who's very familiar with American planning, the American Planning Association's Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. Okay, this is model legislation to implement Agenda 21. And it gives all the local directives to local governments on how to implement Agenda 21 and get away with it. And he's teaching the course that is certifying every planning commission, or more than 85%, I would say now 90% is closer to it in Virginia.
And he has a PhD?
Yes.
What does that stand for? Designated psychopath?
Interesting question. But that's, folks, how our local planners are implementing this stuff and have no idea that what they're implementing comes straight out of the United Nations Agenda 21. Now I'm going to give you an example of good planning versus social engineering, because this is what we're seeing happening across, and I have witnessed it firsthand. Grandpa Jones has a 1,600-acre farm. It's been in the family for 3 generations. The kids are all grown and gone, moved away. So Grandpa Jones decides he wants to sell the family farm and retire. XYZ Developers offers him $1.6 million for the property. So here's the proposed plan that the developers introduced to the local government. We want to rezone 1,400 acres to residential, or rezone 200 acres to commercial, or reserve 100 of the acres, the residential acres, for a future school. We'll build 3,250 homes, which means they're going to have 1 home on 2.5 acres of land. And there'll be a 200-acre shopping center. So here you've got 3,250 more homes with revenue coming into the community. You've got a shopping center bringing jobs to the community. You've got all this construction going on that's going to bring jobs to the community. So there's going to be more than enough revenue to cover the infrastructure necessary for this one small development. You know, putting it in perspective, it's a small development. But everybody stands to make a lot of money, including local government, except the local government's comprehensive plan says that Jones Farm is outside the urban boundary. So utilities can't be extended, because now, you know, we've got these new urban boundary zones, and we don't want to develop outside of those. 20% of the land has to be dedicated to the county for public use, so 100 acres just won't do. It's going to have to be 320 acres. 500 acres is a protected area on the land. Remember the 6510? They've used a little less on this comprehensive plan. Open space provision allows only 1 structure per 40 acres on the remaining land, which means only 28 homes can be built. So XYZ developers, so they can't make any money. They abandoned the project. There's lost revenue for the county, no new jobs, no retirement for Grandpa Jones. The land is now stripped of its value because it can never be developed with those strict comprehensive plans, and the county owes Grandpa Jones nothing. That's an example of social engineering. And that's how you force all future development from this area to this area, and you create this. Remember that treaty that was never ratified? This is how it's done using social engineering at the local level. So now we're faced with the direction for the future. Will it be the vision for sustainable development Or will it be the vision of the founders? Remember, you either have the right to own property or you become property. Thank you. Have a good day.